The start of 2022 promised us even more performance packaged into our thin and light laptop with these new variants of CPU, GPU, and yes, even RAM. The question then becomes, will the performance bump from the combined effort of Intel's new 12th generation Alder Lake 14-core CPUs, Nvidia's new TI variants of their GPUs, and yes, DDR5 RAM be sufficient to warrant that price premium? So let's talk about it. Now, the natural way to answer that question would be to compare it to the previous generation. Now, let's take my Razer Blade as an example. It has Intel's 11th generation i7 with 8 cores. It has 32 gigs of RAM. It has Nvidia's 3070 with 256 bits bus and 8 gigs of VRAM. So, the logical thing for me would be to, well, stay within the Razer family, especially since I'm kind of spoiled by its features and its premium sort of outlook. But the problem with that is that their new variants, the new Razer Blades, are now retailing at around 3,800 Canadian dollars with the similar spec device with 12th gen i7, with 3070 Ti, with 16 gigs of RAM, actually not even 32 gigs of RAM. So after tax, that is gonna go easily into the 4,000 range. Now that is a really steep price to pay, considering that this model that I purchased last year costed me around 3,200 Canadian dollars with, well, 16 gigs of RAM. So where can I find a budget-friendly, understated looking thin and light gaming laptop? It seems MSI has the answer, as it understands that it has customers out there who are ashamed of their gamer-esque heritage and want to hide that in public, naturally, like me. So, introducing or reintroducing their aptly named Stealth series. This particular model is the GS-66 Stealth. This is the 15-inch version. It also comes in the 17-inch version called the GS-77, I believe, though it's probably not in stock. This one has the QHD display with 1440p, and yes, you can also have it in Ultra HD, which is 4K, or in a full HD resolution. But with the performance specs that this has, I think QHD would be the more suitable option. It comes with 32 gigabytes of 4800 MHz DDR5 RAM, 1 terabyte of PCIe Gen 4 storage. It could have been Gen 5, but so far I haven't seen that in the market. It has Nvidia's 3070 Ti or Ti, but it still comes with the same 256 bus configuration and same 8 gigs of VRAM. However, boost clock speeds, as I understand, are slightly higher than the previous one, so let's see how that works out. Finally, coming down to the processor, it has Intel's 12th generation Alder Lake 14-core CPU. Now, not all of those cores are made equal. 6 of them are performance cores, which are the bigger, heavy lifting cores, and then 8 of them are efficiency cores, which are supposed to handle like the back-end, background sort of tasks in a power efficient way. Put them together and they're supposed to produce around 19% better performance in comparison to the 11th gen. At least that's what Intel says. Before I go into the results of my testing and my experiences of using the Stealth, just a quick request, please do subscribe to my channel. I'm kind of new and would really appreciate the support. Also, if you find this video helpful, please do click the like button. Moving on to the look and feel of this device, I'm gonna obviously compare it to my Razer Blade. First impressions, it is noticeably heavier and it is noticeably thicker as well. Although the good news is it still feels premium to hold. It has that aluminum and metallic feel to it, which is kind of nice. When we talk about I/O, well, it has 2 USB-A ports, one less than my Razer. There's one port on the right, one port on the left, both are 3.2. We also have 2 Type-C ports on the right, which is, more in line with modern I/O, I suppose. However, there's another Type-C port on the left side. This is Thunderbolt 4, so that's good news. Also, on the right, there's the Ethernet jack and also the headphone jack, which is good that it's located towards the chin so that your wire doesn't cross over the keyboard and bug you. Moving to the right side, you'll see the power jack and also HDMI. So this is the 2.1 version. It should be able to give you 120 Hz at a 4K display. And also this little dot right here, which shows if your laptop is charging, like a little white light there. Another thing you may have noticed is like the difference between the vents on the back. Now the vents on the right side are larger, on the right side in general. It's because that's where the GPU is, and MSI has a unique approach to cooling here because this side actually houses two fans. One is slightly smaller than the other, but overall is supposed to create a better cooling outcome for the GPU. And on the left side, you will just see one fan there with slightly smaller vents on the left and right. And then if we move to the bottom, we will see clean and simple, lots of little holes milled into the bottom to keep the components cooled and breathing easy. And when we open this up, the first thing that I noticed was it still has that old 11th gen Intel sticker. I mean, this was an opportunity for Intel to show off that new hardware, but that's fine. The other thing that I immediately noticed was this keyboard, or particularly the font, which was larger than I would have liked, and also that Spider-Man-esque font is not for me. It's the only thing that steps away from the overall design, which is understated and stealthy. This font, however, is not. When you power it up using the power key on the right top side, embedded within the keyboard itself, you are greeted by the lights themselves. There's nothing particularly problematic with the lights, but I thought that in well-lit environments, the color reproduction wasn't all that great. I would easily admit that this RGB is way better than the ones that I saw on ASUS's ROG Strix Scar laptop. However, it's still not as bright as the ones that I have on my Razer. Generally, I just felt the colors were not as vibrant enough to my liking. If RGB is not a thing that is important to you, you can easily dismiss that problem. You do have the SteelSeries software to customize your RGB to your liking. However, I thought that the keyboard lights were not customizable as well as I found them on Corsair IQ or Razer Synapse. Now, the keyboard typing experience was so much better than I had actually anticipated. The keys are still a little bit squishy, but in comparison to my blade, I enjoyed typing on this more than I did there. Not as much as I enjoy typing on a ThinkPad keyboard, but the keys on this, because they're larger and they've got little spacing between each of them, it means that this is, in comparison, a more comfortable typing experience. A good test of that was that I made very few errors and there wasn't a lot of fatigue after typing down a few paragraphs. Another thing that I did notice about this was the control key, which is as wide as the shift key. Now that should make your first person shooters more comfortable because usually I use the control key as my crouch key. The function key is usually found here, but on this device it's on the right side, sort of coupled with the control key. And right next to it is actually the volume control, which are secondary to the arrow keys, which I felt to be more comfortable because you can just use one finger to increase or decrease the volume. And also the screen brightness is also there as the up and down keys. So you can increase and decrease the brightness by using one hand. It also has a makeshift crosshair, like a crosshair overlay in the screen as well. So that could help you in your first person shooters if you're playing hardcore mode, a good way to cheat. One thing that I'm missing out on are dedicated media keys, for play and pause and for, going to the next track and going to the previous track. However, I believe you can still fix those into the SteelSeries software because you can tailor some macros to some of the keys here. Now the touchpad is, I believe, a glass touchpad, and by the looks of it, it looks much wider than conventional devices, but in reality, this touchpad is actually as wide as the one in my blade, however shorter than the one in my blade. Overall experience turns out that obviously I would prefer the blade's touchpad to this. The clicks, while tactile and they feel good, still are not as refined as the ones that I have in my blade, but nothing objectionable about it. In comparison to the Omen that I was using earlier and the ROG Scar, this is a much more comfortable trackpad and feels a little bit more premium. Another unique thing about the trackpad here is this little box, and it is not a macro key, it is actually obviously the biometric sensor for your finger. This is not something common. The last time I saw fingerprint biometrics in a gaming device was actually on the Legion Slim 7. It was integrated within the power key up here and that was a really good experience. This is also pretty good. If you're not into logging in into Windows using your finger biometric, you can actually use Windows Hello because it has that too. So that is a bit of a rare combination to have both in a gaming laptop. This one has it. That takes me to the next bit, which is the camera. It's a 720p camera here, but honestly I feel like it feels more like a 480p camera. The results are extremely pixelated and not exactly preferable for any kind of video conferencing or any video call whatsoever. It's a shame to still see in 2022 laptops that come with such poorly configured cameras. A big no-no for me. Now let's quickly talk about sound and the speakers. I know what you're thinking. This vent right here, this grill right here is not for speakers, this is for ventilation. In comparison to the blade, however, the blade sucks in air from underneath the keyboard, so it has that secondary effect of keeping the left and right hand side of the keyboard kind of cool. Now what you'll see is a very interesting brand on the bottom left of this device mirrored into the chassis itself, Dyna Audio. My overall experience was that the sound from this is definitely much better than average. I feel like it's definitely better than my Blade. You can actually feel the vibration from the bass notes travel through the chassis, and if you have your wrists on your left and right, you can actually feel a little bit of that thump travel through the chassis. Now the display is QHD, meaning running at 1440p or 2K, and running at 240 Hz in comparison to the 165 Hz on my Razer. Just a quick note there, personally for me, I don't find a lot of difference between say 144, 165 Hz and 240 Hz. Those of you who are into competitive play can take advantage of that, but if you're a casual gamer, that extra 100 or so Hz is okay, it's not a big deal. It does come with MSI True Color app, which helps you set up this display for say creative functions. If you're designing something and you want to stay color accurate, this display apparently does really boast its color accuracy. An interesting thing that I did notice about it is kind of quirky, that when I brought up content on this display, which was sort of predominantly white, the display brightness went up a little bit, and the opposite was true when I brought forward like some darker content, like some black screen there. It kind of is working like HDR. As far as I've read of the configuration of this device is not HDR. I obviously need to mention the battery in this as well. It is 99.9 watt hours. They've actually also mentioned that down in their sticker as well, and it's had some significant size. If they had put in just 0.1 more, it would have been illegal to bring this onto an airline. So that's the hugeness of the battery itself. Regular media consumption use for me, however, did give me around 7 to 8 hours. It could have been more. Maybe I used it a bit much because I had like games installing in the background, softwares installing in the background while I was browsing, also having a video playing in the background. So I was putting it under decent load, but considering the size of the battery and also considering that this has those fancy efficiency cores that Intel has talked about, I was hoping to get more out of this battery and see like double digits. But perhaps under lighter loads maybe, and of course looking into more upgrades and more software developments in the future, taking into account this new Intel architecture, I believe over time this would get much better. But for now, 7 to 8 hours, which is okay, it's not so bad. The real benefits of that bigger battery actually came for me during gaming. I unplugged it and I had about 2 hours of use, which is a decent time, while doing heavy gaming, while playing COD, while playing Forza Horizon 5, with Nvidia's battery boost actually turned off. So that means uncapped frames, and overall it was a good experience. Since this is my first MSI laptop, this was my first experience with MSI's internal center, like Legion's Vantage software, like Razer Synapse, like Corsair's IQ. I felt the software was basic in nature and it didn't give me a lot of options. One important thing I did find was that you can actually switch between discrete graphics and like a hybrid graphics and the integrated graphics on board as well, meaning there is a mux switch built inside of this, which could help you boost even more battery life out of this. I didn't try it, but it's promising to start that off with, so I'm glad they have that feature there. I should also talk about its power adapter. Now it's made by a third party called Delta Electronics. What I like about this adapter is that it is relatively smaller in size. It's definitely much better than ASUS's implementation of gamer adapters. It has an output of 240 watts. However, the wire itself, although I feel almost kind of sufficient, it could have been longer. For those of you with bigger desks, may struggle to put this on the floor while having this plugged into your device. Now let's actually talk about the good stuff. Let's actually talk about the numbers and the performance bumps that I have experienced in my usage of this device. And I even put together an Excel sheet. To get a feel for real world performance gains, I tested 11 games on this device with using their internal benchmarks to get a feel for where the Razer was and where the MSI was. Now I have to point out, in terms of settings for individual games, all the games were run at 1440p at 2K resolution. All the settings were cranked out to the absolute highest setting as well to get the most out of this hardware. Now let's start off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Yes, the game's a little bit old, but the benchmark is really popular, so you can compare it with your previous generation devices as well if you want. So for the Razer, with all the settings maxed out, I was getting around 81 frames per second on average. And when I ran the same test at the same settings for the MSI, I was getting around 99 frames. Now for the first test, this was giving me a bump of about 22%. Now that's a significant bump to experience within 1 year. So then let's move to a very favorite racing game of mine, Forza Horizon 5. It's a very pretty game, especially when you crank it out to the highest settings. And in a 15-inch display on my Blade with QHD settings, it looks brilliant. Now, in terms of this benchmark, the average frames I got was on my Razer 74 frames. So what do you think I could have gotten in the MSI, right? Considering the trend of 20%, I was thinking somewhere around 100 frames as well. Turns out, interestingly, for this game, I got the exact same result for the MSI. And that makes me think that naturally, games which are better developed and better tuned to utilize this new Intel architecture, to utilize the DDR5, to utilize the TI settings. Moving forward, as more drivers get released, as more games get updated, we can expect better performance out of this new hardware as well. Another thing that I noticed, naturally because of that higher clock speed and RAM, my games were actually loading faster. You can say almost 20% faster in comparison to my Blade. Onwards to the other Horizon, which is Horizon Zero Dawn, Sony's game on PC, and that's one of the best campaigns that I've ever played. I really love that game. That new version's out there. I'm kind of upset that it's not available on PC. Damn you, Sony. So, the Razer for me in Horizon Zero Dawn was giving me at maximum settings 1440p at 61 frames. For a story-driven game, 60 frames is perfect, especially with all of the settings maxed out. Over here, the MSI did gain some respect back and it gave me 74 frames on average. Now that again equates to more than 20% of a performance gain in less than 6 months. So things are again looking up again. So after this, I want to move on to a rather underrated game, but again, it's a really good looking game, Division 2. It's a bit of an old game, but I think the benchmark can still be quite relevant because it uses a lot of resources. For the Razer, I was getting around 54 frames. Compared to the MSI, that was giving me 58 frames. So not a significant difference in terms of percentage. That's only roughly around 7%. So I'm finding a bit of a logic there that the performance increase can vary to how well these games or these applications are programmed to utilize this brand new hardware. So in time, I feel like with updates rolling out to these new softwares, to these new games, you can expect even a bigger performance bump. But again, that's just a hypothesis. And moving to another really popular game, this one's still a bit old, GTA 5. GTA's benchmark doesn't exactly give a precise average frames towards the end of its test. It's kind of strange, but I just did like a screen-to-screen comparison to understand what were the average frames between them. I cranked up everything to the absolute max, population density, scaling range, everything to the absolute max, long shadows, you name it, and I was getting around 60 frames on my Razer Blade. And for the MSI, I was getting, well, a more than 20% bump at 75 frames. So we are going back into that same expected territory. I'm seeing mostly games that have been optimized would see a performance bump in the near 20%. From there, we move back up into our more recent times and did a benchmark from Far Cry 6. Although that game is more optimized for AMD architecture at the maxed out settings at 1440p, I was getting 64 frames on my Razer Blade. Again, a very good looking game. And in comparison, on the MSI, I was getting 79 frames, a bump of 23%. That's a very decent bump again as well. Maybe these newer games are more prepared for this new hardware architecture, so we can expect more performance there as a reference. Up next, Red Dead Redemption 2, and I still remember the first time that game was launched. It was the ultimate test for any new GPU and for any new hardware. Even now, when I tested on AMD graphics, that game gives me easily like a 30-40% bump just off the bat. Nvidia's don't really handshake well with this game for some reason. On the Razer Blade, I was getting 43 frames. Again, it's less than 60 frames, but still the game is very much playable even at the highest maxed out settings at 1440p. Now on MSI, with the same settings, I was getting on Red Dead Redemption 2 53 frames, which again is a 22% bump. Things are again looking up. Over to Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I don't have Valhalla because I have yet to complete Odyssey. Odyssey was giving on the Razer Blade at max out setting 42 frames per second, and in comparison, the MSI was giving a boost of 90% and taking the game's frames up to 50%. And that is a very respectable performance bump. Now I also tested Gears of War 5, and for the Razer Blade, I was getting 65 frames, a decent frame rate at maxed out settings. Although this is the only game I tested in which the MSI was giving me poorer performance. So that gave me an average frame rate of 64 frames. It's not a big difference. You can roughly say it's the same result. If I had redone the benchmark, I'd probably still get 65, but there was no performance boost there as well. Maybe there's room to optimize the game programming in general, but hey, there you have it. Now coming back to more recent times again, I did the benchmark for Guardians of the Galaxy, and again that's a very good looking game, very pretty game, but I felt like it was very well optimized for PC hardware. And for the Razer Blade, I was getting 71 frames, which is again a very decent frame rate. And on the MSI, as I had expected, because it was programmed well, this game is programmed well, so I was getting 88 frames, a boost of 24%. Now these results came with ray tracing off and DLSS off as well. In general, for the rest of the games as well, I had kept DLSS off. If I am using ray tracing, that's where I use DLSS, otherwise I keep them off. So for the MSI only, I tested the game with ray tracing on at its ultimate setting and with DLSS on with the balance setting, and I was getting a fair 74 frames. Without ray tracing and DLSS, I was getting 88 frames, and with ray tracing and DLSS, I was getting around 74 frames. Now personally, between you and me, I just don't get ray tracing. It's just so overly hyped, because the advantages in your visual appeal are just so minimal. I barely notice any difference in terms of non-ray tracing and ray tracing, but the performance cost of it is just so high. I just don't get the point of turning on ray tracing. I also tested Cyberpunk, and because Cyberpunk was the poster child for ray tracing, I did test it on ultra ray tracing settings with DLSS on at the balance setting, not the quality one. For my Razer Blade, with the new 1.5 patch on Cyberpunk, I was getting 44 frames per second, which is just right for a campaign game. It's not a problem. And then on the MSI, with the same settings, ray tracing turned on to the absolute full, I was getting 50 frames per second. So that was about a 14% jump. Also finally, I also did run 3DMark's Time Spy score, and on my Razer, I was getting 7,189 points. And with the MSI, I was getting, well, you guessed it, 22% higher performance, and with a score at 8,760. So if I average all of these performance numbers together, excluding the negative ones, excluding that one negative score, I'm seeing roughly a performance bump of 20%. So now our formula becomes really simple. If the performance bump is 20% for me from the old generation, then I can expect a 20% price jump in this as well. Fair enough? Now let's take that formula and apply it to my situation and see if that $3,800 Razer Blade is actually worth this price bump, taking 20% as an example. So if I go to their website right now, I'll see that my Razer Blade Advanced is still retailing at around $3,300. So, well, the formula is simple. You just if I put so this is a bit of an oversimplification on my part, but hey, let's just go through with it. If we add 20% to $3,300, we get a result of around $3,960. So with the new Razer Blade at $3,800 is a fair deal. Overall, it's just the problem is it's in a price bracket that's just too premium for the likes of me, or I hope other regular buyers as well. So the Razer is still out, even though that price is justified. Razer's out. Now let's come back to the MSI, which I have aptly labeled it to be like the cheaper, more affordable Razer Blade at a very modest $3,200. The MSI is the perfect middle ground between the most premium and more expensive laptops like the Blade and the more plasticky entry-level devices. On paper, yeah, 20% seems like a significant jump compared to simply like 6-7 months ago. But if we just take the 11th gen laptops right now with the 3070s, with the same configured same QHD screen, I feel like you can get a lot of devices from a lot of manufacturers, like almost all of them except Razer, at around $2,500. You can get Alienwares for $2,500. You can get your Legions at around $2,500. You can get MSIs for less than $2,500. Would you pay $600-700 more for 20% performance games? 20% is a really decent bump. But when we're talking about boosting frames from 60 to 75 frames, or from 70 to 80 frames, 90 frames, for me, like the visual result of it, like the intangible visual result of it, or my experience, remains relatively the same. My eyes are not distinguishing between 60 and 75 frames right there. I'm just enjoying my game at the highest settings, and the game is running perfectly smoothly, as smooth as it can possibly be for a casual game. For more competitive games, yes, those additional 10-12 frames or those additional 20 frames can make a difference. Obviously, if you have the resources for it, by all means go for it. But if you have a balanced mindset, I would recommend stick it out with the 11th gen. You can get the previous generation on sale, you can get a good deal on it and still enjoy some carefree casual gaming on a portable thin and light device. So that's it for now. Thank you all very much for watching this video. If you found this useful, please press the thumbs up button.